Thank you very much. This is going to be a new and unusual experience for me. That is, usually, whenever I stand up and talk and lecture, I'm talking about something where I'm sure that I know what I think. And I'm also arrogant enough that when I'm sure I know what I think, I'm also pretty close to being absolutely sure that I am right, that I understand the situation, that I understand what's going on. And thus I regard my task as that of shedding light into dark corners, of bringing enlightenment to an audience. And that's not the case here. Here I genuinely don't know what I think. And I'm looking for enlightenment, rather than, say, trying to spread it. So where should I start? I suppose a good place to start is with the presidential election of 1992. When, thanks to Ross Perot's splitting the relatively right-of-center electorate, Bill Clinton rolls into office with 43% of the nationwide popular vote and takes the head of the U.S. government at the head of an extraordinarily fractured and querulous Democratic coalition, which has relatively little respect for him. That is, the Democratic congressional barons regarding themselves as much smarter and wiser and more experienced than this guy from Arkansas who they hadn't heard of 2 years ago, and unwilling to give him much deference. You can say what you want about Bill Clinton. You have to start with the jokes about the zipper problem. But I think he played a weak hand extraordinarily skillfully during his time as president. And during his first year in office, he did two things. He did a grand budget that finally put the U.S. budget deficit created by Ronald Reagan on a downward trajectory. And in the process did a bunch of good things, the expansion of the earned income tax credit to move a bunch more money to people who were relatively poor in America, and so forth. And he did Nafta. He made the second priority of his first year in office to be to pick up the threads that George H.W. Bush and his administration had left behind, and to push through this North American free trade agreement that George H.W. Bush and company had negotiated. But at the time, there was great questioning as to whether this was the right course to take. That is, the first of Clinton's priorities, the budget, was with some extra bells and whistles in a redistributive direction to equalize income a bit, was with some bells and whistles to equalize income, but mostly it was an Eisenhower Republican priority, kind of sound finance. And for his second initiative, rather than pick something out of the genuinely long list of Democratic initiatives lying fallow, Bob Reich's Labor Department proposals to put serious money into making it easier for people to find jobs, a welfare reform proposal that would actually have focused serious money on helping train people for work, rather than just telling them that they ought to get jobs and assuring them that the market would provide. Rather than doing either of these, Clinton chose another Republican or semi-Republican priority, free trade. In this case, free trade with Mexico. And there were lots of powerful reasons why Clinton chose this for his second initiative. One of them being he thought he could get it passed. Well, it was not at all clear he could assemble a coalition for welfare reform or health care reform in the fall of 1992. But at the time, it was a matter of great concern over whether this was the right thing to do, whether this was going to work, and if so, what its impact on the future of North America would be. And so that's where I got interested in NAFTA, seriously interested in NAFTA, because I spent a good part of 3 months of my life doing analytical support for the effort to persuade the Congress to pass and ratify NAFTA. And in the process saw lots and lots of arguments, made lots and lots of predictions about the way the future was going. And now it's time to take a look back and see what did the thing actually do. And the answer is that I'm really unsure. Now, if you'd asked me 6 years ago, if you'd asked me in 2000, I would then have been ready to conclude that NAFTA was a major success. The key argument in favor of NAFTA had always been that it was the most promising road open to raise the chances for Mexican development, to increase the odds that Mexico would become democratic and prosperous. And that even though NAFTA had been associated with yet another peso crisis, I would have said 6 years ago that the effects of NAFTA had been in the direction of helping Mexican development, and thus that the U.S. was actually performed its neighborly duty to try to help Mexico develop economically, and also politically and socially, and also that it had been a good deal for the United States because a Mexico that is better off is a very good thing for the United States. It's much better to have prosperous, democratic, relatively wealthy, socially calm neighbors than the reverse. And 6 years ago, I'd have pointed to the fact that even though there had been yet another peso crisis, that even though Mexico's late 1990s had been relatively rough, I would have pointed to the fact that exports had boomed, that NAFTA had done its job making Mexico a nice place to produce in order to serve the world's largest consumer market, and that with guaranteed tariff-free access to the world's largest consumer market, that couldn't help but be a positive step in Mexican development. Now I'm not so sure. That is, exports have boomed, exports have continued to boom. Mexican exports have gone from 10% of Mexican GDP in 1990 to 17% of GDP 6 years ago, to it looks like 28% of GDP today. Next year, Mexico's real exports look like they will be fully 5 times what they were in 1990. Mexico has globalized with a vengeance under NAFTA. But since NAFTA, Mexican real GDP has, as best as we can measure, grown at 3.6 per year. And you might say 3.6 per year, 10 per year is a healthy number, but that's before you subtracted off Mexican population growth of 2.3% per year, leaving real GDP growth in Mexico to be at 1.3% per year. Slower than the United States, slower than Western Europe. Mexico, in terms of economic prosperity, is further behind the United States now than it was at the start of the 90s, than it was when NAFTA was passed. If you believe that free trade has as its major purpose that of equalizing economies, that of providing the poor with opportunities to successfully emulate the richer, it's not happening. The gap is growing. The way that NAFTA was supposed to work, although it's called the North American Free Trade Agreement, free trade is perhaps, well, the key to NAFTA is not that it would drop tariffs, and not so much that it eliminated quotas. The key to NAFTA was not what it did, but what it kept future Mexican and American governments from doing. When NAFTA was passed, American tariffs on imports from Mexico were very low. But what NAFTA did was that it bound the United States never to raise them again. To the extent that the argument was that lots of potential companies and businesses thought that locating in Mexico to produce for the American market was something that was dangerous, chancy, and dicey, given the possibility that protectionist sentiment could suddenly rise up in the United States again. NAFTA was supposed to bind the United States not to do that, and thus give Mexico a powerful potential edge vis-a-vis other overseas places where you might think of producing from the United States, for example, China. Second, NAFTA was supposed to bind the Mexican government to welcome and to accommodate international investment, to welcome and accommodate investment from abroad. To the extent that there was a great fear that one reason Mexican economic development was relatively slow It was because of the populist history of the institutional revolutionary party made lots of first world investors skeptical about the long-run value of wealth they could commit to Mexico. The idea that Nafta would bind Mexico to respect the property of the rich elsewhere that they were putting in Mexico, it was hoped that that would be a powerful incentive to make people boost investment in Mexico and so expand its capital stock, its ability to export, and ultimately its standard of living. So the hope was that with NAFTA guaranteeing Mexican producers tariff and quota-free access to the U.S. market, the largest consumer market in the world, no matter what else happened in U.S. politics, no matter how protectionist the U.S. became vis-a-vis other producers, and with NAFTA also binding the Mexican government to allow foreign investors to earn healthy rates of return, that this would be a potential division of labor bonanza for Mexico. That increasing trade between the U.S. and Mexico would move both countries toward a greater degree of specialization and a finer division of labor in important industries like autos, where labor-intensive portions were increasingly accomplished in Mexico, textiles, with high-tech spinning and weaving done by machines in the U.S., with lower-tech cutting and sewing done elsewhere, and that such efficiency gains from increasing the extent of the market and promoting the division of labor, well, they should have, by the gospel that we economists have preached for nearly 2.5 centuries now, they should have produced rapid growth in Mexican productivity. Likewise, greater efficiency should have been reinforced by a boom in capital formation, which would have accompanied the guarantee that no future wave of protectionism in the U.S. would shut down factories in Mexico, and that no future wave of populism in Mexico would confiscate foreign-owned factories in Mexico. And the key word here is should. Right? Today there are perhaps 100 million Americans with real incomes at purchasing power parities that average perhaps a quarter of the U.S. level, with regional differences stretching from half the U.S. level up in the north down to a tenth of the U.S. level in the south. Mexicans are investing perhaps a fifth of their GDP in capital formation. The capital stock in Mexico is growing at a very healthy rate, and have enormously expanded their integration into the world, or at least the North American economy, since NAFTA. But 3.6 rate of growth of GDP, coupled with a 2.3% rate of population increase. The mean income of Mexico today is barely 15% above that of pre-NAFTA days. And because of rising inequality, the overwhelming majority of Mexicans live no better off than their counterparts did 15 years ago. The only part of Mexican development that you can call a great success has been first the enormous expansion of exports, and those who are doing well off of that expansion of exports, which is overwhelmingly not the workers working in the export industries, and the extraordinary rise in incomes and living standards that comes from greatly increased remittances sent back to Mexico from the United States. And for our economists, this is intellectually a great puzzle. Right? We believe in market forces, we believe in the benefits of trade, specialization, of the international division of labor. We think we have seen successful pro-market policies at work in North America and Western Europe over the past 2.25 centuries. We see the enormous increase in Mexican exports to the U.S. over the past decade. We see great strengths in the Mexican economy. A stable macroeconomic environment, fiscal prudence, low inflation, little country risk, a labor force that is increasingly able to move around the country to where the jobs are, a strengthened and solvent banking system, poverty reduction programs that we have at least hope are effective and will be further reformed, high earnings from oil, and so forth. Yet what looked to us like successful neoliberal policies, right, what looked to me like successful implementation of policies 6 years ago that would be guaranteed to deliver a genuine boom accompanied by rapidly rising real wages in Mexico. They have not delivered the rapid increases in productivity and in working class wages that neoliberals like me that we would have confidently predicted had we been told back in 1993 that Mexican exports would multiply fivefold in the next 13 years. That if you told me back in 1993 that Nafta will pass and Mexican exports will expand fivefold over the next 13 years, I would have said, well, that's done. It's clearly going to be a wild and extraordinary success. And Mexico is going to be a richer and more developed country significantly come 2006 than it is back in 1992. And the stakes matter. The stakes matter a lot because economic systems that are perceived not to be working, that are perceived not to be generating kind of greatly increased prosperity, are enormous sources of political danger. That at the working class level, the existing inequalities and hierarchies seen in society, if they have any justification at all, they can be tolerated only if the system works. And the system works in the sense of bringing the country and its people's standards of living close to the relatively high and prosperous level that it's obvious that countries can achieve in the world today. And from the perspective of elites, kind of the game of increasing democratization, of playing by the international rules and domestically playing by the rules of free elections, rule of law, respect for property, but also respect for the political demands from the relatively poor for redistribution. These also seem to turn on a relatively rapid degree of economic advance. That is, elites can play three games. They can play the game of we own property and collect rents and profits and recognize that we have to pay a share of that for downward income redistribution because we live in democratic states under the rule of law. They can play the game of rigging elections and extorting wealth from everyone who has to deal with the government. They can play the game of debt swaps. Elites all over the world play these three games, and only when economic progress is relatively rapid is there a chance that they can be convinced in a stable fashion to keep playing the first, the good game, the positive sum game, rather than the other. Now you look at Mexican politics today, and even with the great doubt, to say the least, about what the real outcome of the last presidential election was, there has still been great improvement in political openness and in political competition, since the heyday of the PRI's rule back in the 70s and 80s. But how long will this remain stable? A faster growing Mexico seems to be a precondition for long-run stability. So here I sit in 2006, having confidently recommended 13 years ago a program of neoliberal openness and for Mexico's economic development. It's scratching my head because the first two stages of it seem to have been secured. That is, Nafta passed, yes. Rapid expansion of the Mexican exports, yes. Political opening, as Mexico's elite seems to want to act more like a North American elite in terms of willingness to accept the rules of the democratic game, yes. But where's the payoff? Where are the benefits to the median Mexican of this shift to neoliberal policies? And why haven't they shown up visibly? And, there are at least four potential answers I can give. The first answer, and this I owe to Michael Kremer of Harvard and Brookings, is that those of us who in the early 1990s were talking about the benefits of export-led development and about how more countries should adopt export-led development strategies focused on increasing their openness and integration with the world economy, that we overlooked one thing. Now, admittedly, it's kind of hard to overlook because it has 1.3 billion people and sits there just across the Pacific, and if you go down to the port of Oakland, let alone Long Beach, You can see its economic impact coming in every day in container ships piled 5 high. But the one thing we overlooked was China. That Michael Kremer's argument is that in any generation there is only so much space for export-led development, right? Only so much space on the sofa. And, you know, in the 1970s there can be space for Southern Europe and Japan and the East Asian tigers, and they can all sit comfortably on the sofa, one in each of the 3 seats. But, you know, China takes up 5 seats all by itself. If China is sitting on the export-led development sofa, there's no place for anybody else to do anything other than watch the U.S. price of their goods they make fall and try to figure out how can we reduce what we pay our workers a little more so we can stay competitive with this extraordinary thing going on across the ocean. And that first answer is that, you know, we neoliberals gave Mexico exactly the wrong advice about when to jump onto the export-led development merry-go-round. There is a moment not to. It's when China is about to stand up. And that's certainly one possibility. I haven't quite been able to make the numbers right, but that's simply one possibility. That we were idiots and failed to understand how fast China would successfully grow, and what this impact would be on export-led development from countries like Mexico. Although in our defense, we can say this was just in the aftermath of Tiananmen and the kind of collapse of China into another era of revolution and political struggle seemed more likely than did the extraordinary economic boom that's been accomplished over the past 13 years. So that's the first from China. The second is, demography, the demographic burden of Mexico's rapid population growth. That Mexico has not yet made its way through the demographic transition. And when it is the case that you have to find space for 2.3% more people every year, you know, more houses, more highways, more infrastructure, more education, that simply the burden of sustaining that rate of increase of your capital stock simply to hold yourself constant relative to your rapidly growing population, that makes expecting rapid economic growth unlikely. That a lot more would have to go right altogether, and that we cannot expect Mexico to see significant increases in average standards of living until we go down another generation and see the birth rate drop a little bit more, right, as it will, as it always has. And once Mexican native population growth is down to 1 or 1.5%, all of a sudden a great deal of investment will be able to go into making workers more productive rather than equipping workers with kind of the capital they need to survive and the infrastructure and housing they need to live. And that all we need to do is wait. That we promised the coming of the neoliberal kingdom inside a decade, and it will actually take a generation or two because the demography has to work itself out. And the third possibility is, so for that second one, our problem was we overpromised. That is, as indeed people like Rudy Dornbush and Paul Krugman were warning in the early 1990s, that the rhetoric associated with the so-called Washington Consensus, unquote, was greatly overstated, and that policies, while good, would be unlikely to produce anything like the buzz around them. And, Paul Krugman is still around, and I promise to listen to him more carefully in the future, because he was right. Rudy Dornbush, alas, is not still around. But this is yet another sign that I should think in the back of my brain, what would Rudy say? Because he was very wise about this as well. So we have China, we have demography. We have third, that we were simply focusing on the wrong things. Right? That you look at the economic deficiencies that still abound in Mexico, and you see an extraordinarily low average numbers of years of schooling, and more important, with young workers having almost no more formal education than their older counterparts. We see little on-the-job training, in large part because of low schooling. That transplant factories from America are running at Detroit or Cleveland or St. Louis kind of levels of staffing because good workers are still remarkably hard to find. And so the possibilities of having a more employment-intensive manufacturing to boost real wages in Mexico as kind of factories start up there isn't really coming to pass. Heavy bureaucratic burdens on firms, corrupt judges on police, high crime rates, a low productivity informal sector that narrows the tax base, although it contributes to the incomes of local functionaries. But these deficiencies should not have been enough to neutralize Mexico's powerful geographic advantages and the potent benefits of the policies that Adam Smith recommended 230 years ago, should they? Well, they may have been. They may have been enough. We may have been wrong to focus on trade and to have been much better placed to focus on education and corruption. Right, to have told Carlos Salinas de Gortari and company they shouldn't focus on how they can integrate with North America so that all their friends can easily move money from Mexico City to New York and back again. But instead, they should have focused on getting teachers who know how to teach and aren't just the feckless cousin of the local party boss who needs a job, right, into the schools. That a much more social democratic, social investment agenda might have served Mexico much, much better. And so that's part 3, right? That's simply building up the social and educational capital. That maybe that was the key link to Mexican development rather than increasing trade. Certainly there's every reason to think it is the key link now. That only chunks of the Mexican school system that had the potential of the Malaysian school system or the Thai school system or the Chinese school system, then we might well see lots of things going much better in Mexico. And the fourth possibility is just that we were right after all, that things are just taking longer than we expected. Right? And things are just taking longer than expected because the policies that make Mexico an attractive place to produce for export require a lot of changes that you can't just be produced by waving your hands. That the process of building up infrastructure, building up trade links, building up knowledge links, building up transportation links, that's going to be a long process, and that Mexican exports have quintupled over the past 12 years. It tells us that the process is starting, and we shouldn't be expecting to see that the back of the train has not yet started to move, because the train is very, very long. But we neoliberals can at least be confident that the front is moving. And since we have our faith inherited from Adam Smith, the back of the train is still connected to the front of the train. That if I come back in another 5 or 10 years, I'll be much more optimistic, perhaps as optimistic as I was 6 years ago. That may be true, but it's not. It's an excuse. It's not something I bet on. Having witnessed Mexico's slow growth over the past 15 years, I'm shaken. I really don't know what to think. I don't know what the right policy options would have been for the U.S. in 1993 vis-a-vis policies for Mexico. I don't know what the right development strategy for a benevolent Mexican government that wanted to unwind the pre-PRI's domination of Mexican politics and society would have been. In fact, I don't know what the right development policy for a benevolent Mexican government that wants to see Mexico become free, democratic, and prosperous would be today. And they're having raised 90 zillion questions and provided no answers. I want to stop and hear what you have to say. Yeah?
How would you explain that other countries like Colombia are pushing for a free trade agreement? I mean, with the consequences, I mean, it's kind of evident that NAFTA hasn't delivered. So why are these countries after the trade agreement?
Well, there's the cynical answer, there's the optimistic answer. The cynical answer is that elites want to join the pan-American elite, and that closer economic integration is the best way to do that. The best way to get out from under various forms of capital controls and have the United States property law regime kind of ruling throughout the hemisphere, and the best way, to say make it likely that your great-grandchildren can live in New York or Los Angeles or Miami for life if they want to. The kind of closer economic integration is almost surely a good bet for the rich elite in any country if you look forward to a wave of possible futures, in many of which Miami or Los Angeles or New York is a very nice place to live vis-a-vis other options. The way this is put in China is that every rich family in China wants to have at least one cousin in the United States in case you have to flee in the Learjet or the rubber boat. And they may. The last century and a half of political instability is truly remarkable. The optimistic answer is that the wave of U.S. politics is already moving in a protectionist direction. And to try to sneak in, the gate may come down, the United States may cease being the importer of last resort for the world. And if that comes to pass, it's much better to be inside the gates than outside. And here I think Latin American countries are harking back to the experience of Argentina during the Great Depression. The Argentinian economy in the 70 years before 1929 had been built on extremely close integration with Great Britain, but Argentina had been part of Britain's informal economic rather than of its formal political empire. So when the Great Depression comes, Great Britain slams on imperial preference, which means that everything Argentina exports, and that Canada exports, and that Australia exports, and that New Zealand exports, and that South Africa exports, all of a sudden they tell Argentina, you can sell what's left over after we've taken what the Dominions want to sell to us. And that being outside Britain's political empire, with nothing to restrain Britain from its policies of imperial preference, it devastated the Argentine economy in the 1930s, and then led as part of a political reaction to Peronist policies of self-sufficiency in the 1940s and 50s, which meant that Argentina then missed out on the greatest export-led boom the world economy had ever seen, and so got run over coming and going by British tariffs in the 1930s, and then by not trying to export in the 1950s. And I think it's that belief, that successfully concluding a free trade agreement of the Americas would provide an important piece of insurance against, say, Senator Schumer of New York. And it may well come down. It's hard to imagine textile imports in the U.S. remaining as free as they are now for much longer. Yeah.
I guess there's a difference between saying that NAFTA hasn't brought massive economic growth and saying that on the other hand NAFTA has been bad for economic growth. So I guess if you should choose between having a country with a poor education system, rising inequality and free trade, and a country with a poor education system and rising inequality without free trade, I guess wouldn't you choose the former?
Well, I think that let me for the moment channel Harley. Not here. All right, let me channel Harley. And Harley Shaken would say that that's not the choice. The choice is between a Mexico that pursues a social investment and high education agenda in the 1990s, or a Mexico that pursues a neoliberal free trade agenda. You have only so much political, You only have so much political capital, and you can either follow the road of Salinas de Gortari or the road of Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, and the road of Cardenas looks a lot more attractive even to those liberals like me now than it would have looked 14 years ago. The second problem is Iowa, You go to Iowa. It's one gigantic corn and pig farm. It's one gigantic high-tech corn and pig farm. It produces corn and pigs at an efficiency that the world has never before seen. And that would have struck all previous, back to the first days that the first guy in Europe managed to catch a boar or a sow and say, hey, this is a good thing. Or back to the first days when Mexico managed to find this strange plant called teosinte and said, hey, we can do something with this. They would not have believed what's been made of Iowa. And free trade, the fact that the North American Free Trade Agreement was phrased not as America does a favor to Mexico by promising never to raise tariffs against Mexico again, but as a free trade agreement between two countries on formally equal levels of power. And there were important reasons for doing it that way. Very important symbolic and also important institutional reasons. But what this meant is that not only can Mexican producers export manufactured goods to America, and also fruits and vegetables during the few months when it's too rainy in California to harvest much, but also that Iowa can export corn to Mexico. And originally, if I remember correctly, the original draft of Nafta had a special 10-year exemption for imports of corn. And when Lloyd Bentsen came in as Treasury Secretary, his first question about Nafta was, why only 10 years? Why not 2 generations? Did the Bush administration people negotiating this realize exactly how potentially dangerous it is if you consider a Mexico which still has a large number of near-subsistence corn farmers relying on the ability to sell their corn in the market in order to purchase what they need to keep their farms running? Are they aware of how dangerous subjecting them to sudden competition from Iowa it would be? And we called them up and asked them and found that no, indeed, they hadn't. And in the end, it went forward, Lloyd Bentsen opining that he didn't think that he thought Mexican governments would take full advantage of this. And that certainly there was now established in the U.S. Treasury an institutional memory that perhaps this carve-out for corn should be extended, in the event that it turned out to be a source of trouble. Yet the Zedillo government, it dropped tariffs on imports of corn much faster than it was required to under Nafta. In large part because cheap corn for urban workers and voters is a powerful plus, no matter what it's doing to people out in the countryside. So I think that one effect of Nafta has been to put visible downward pressure on the price of corn flour in Mexico, which is something everyone living in the cities loves, but also to greatly accelerate migration from the countryside to Mexico and to impoverish the countryside something, which is seen as an indirect effect, not the result of Nafta, but instead other broader processes. So there are, in my mind at least, serious worries about how large the negative of subjecting Mexico's near-subsistence rural agriculture to competition from Iowa have been. But I can't say that that I have any reason to do more than be fearful.
Corn, though, is highly subsidized in this country, and the subsidies have increased. So
yes.
In '92, you didn't really know how the subsidies were going to be restructured and how large they were going to be. And if the corn is not dumped at below the cost of production, maybe things would have been a little bit better measured that.
Yeah. Although Peter Linder from Davis would say that if there's one iron law, that the true iron law of economics is that subsidies per farmer increase as the farming sector shrinks. Now, it is true that American farmers are now receiving more in government subsidies than they are making in farm value added, and are doing so in direct controversion of all the political science theories of interest group power. Right? They have extremely low power. There aren't very many of them. I mean, there are fewer farmers and farm laborers in America than there are gardeners, groundskeepers, and growers of ornamental plants. Right? And yet, the one thing that no one takes on, the one political interest that no one takes on, is farm subsidies. Right? The only one who made a serious try was Newt Gingrich in one of his few adventures among the children of light. And yet even that was more than totally reversed as soon as he let it sleep. And so it means that we should head on over to sociology or anthropology and talk about the Neolithic Revolution and how a very deep structure of our culture is that the farmer is somehow superior. Perhaps to the cowman, and certainly to the lawyer, and so deserving of protection against the market. But I think we should have known that there were going to be big U.S. export subsidies, or big U.S. subsidies attached to agriculture, because there are, and likely they will, for quite a long time. Yeah?
I just had a good question. I was intrigued by your third point. It's one of the reasons that, that the educational infrastructure in Mexico is anchoring or slowing down the growth in Mexico. Okay. Assuming that that's true, is there a way that Mexico can invest in their infrastructure while kind of assuaging inflation fears of investors?
I don't know. Right? I mean, I would say that's beyond my competence. I would think that doing as much as you can to decentralize education. That education works much, much better when people at the township level are hiring the teachers rather than people at the provincial level who need to find a job for someone's feckless cousin. But that's beyond my competence. Harley? I've channeled you. I have said that you would say that the political energy that went into free trade would have been much, much better employed in the late to the 1990s, being focused for Mexico on improve the education system and invest in social capital agenda, rather than a free trade and North American integration agenda.
Absolutely, I would agree with that. Channeled me correctly. And in fact, I think that Mexico's paying a price for that now in terms of social capital, in terms of its ability, now that it is engaged with China in a way that's fundamentally different than what was the case when the Nafta debate took place.
We recently had an event at class at which David Bonnier argued that the main failure of Nafta was that it hadn't included a European-style cooperation and regional transfer component. I was wondering what your response to that argument would be.
I think it's wonderful to have David Bonnier saying things like that, rather than the only thing we import from Mexicans is hepatitis via strawberries. Which was what David Bonnier was in when I ran into him back in 1998. Yeah. My fears very ferocious then. Yeah, that if you're going to if you're going to try to integrate two economies where labor productivity levels differ by a factor of 5, it seems to be much, much better to do it in, the European-style way, in which you focus a lot on social adjustment and development funds, right? Rather than to simply say, okay, blow the whistle and let the market rip. I'd say that was definitely the true, and I would say that the Clinton administration had somewhat of a bad conscience about this back in 1993. Witness, say, when Congressman Esteban Torres asked for a North American Development Bank. Right, he got a North American Development Bank, a rather small North American Development Bank. But still, you had $6 billion of border infrastructure development that would not have otherwise taken place. And that in some other possible world, right, certainly my bosses, and certainly Bill Clinton, would have much rather have been able to do. Okay, something, regional integration with significant development funds. But yeah, this is 1993. This is deficits that we then thought were extraordinarily high and needed to be cured immediately. And I think Mexico would have become second and third. That after all, if the United States had spent, how much, $5 trillion of today's dollars defending ourselves against the Soviet Union for the previous 40 years, shouldn't we have been willing to spend $100 billion on kind of helping the Soviet Union kind of democratize and make the transition? That $50 for bombs versus not even $1, 20 cents for development seem to be our high priorities.
But it's not too late. It could still be included, but it's not on the political agenda.
No, it's, well, maybe after November. I say the current, what was it? It was President Lagos last Thursday saying that for the next 2 years or so, his fondest hope is to be totally, Latin America is totally ignored by the because when the Republican Party focuses on it, well, let's get a border fence and throw out a bunch more people. And even though here, where the Bush administration has been trying to tame the demons its political arm was raising. So ask me in 2009, when we can rethink. Yes? Bradford?
Two questions. In terms of the talk in Washington at the time, I mean, the one sort of immobile factor, or relatively immobile factor, was going to be labor. And we knew the Mexican agricultural sector would get a big shock. I mean, shouldn't the friends in Mexico have been saying we should be standing on the border with, with work visas, handing them out like ice cream cones? So that's question one. And then two is, you talked a lot about the trade side, but on the capital account side, sort of what happened with Mexico? Did Mexicans, sort of small savers in middle-class towns, take their money and put it in the United States? Did that have an effect on sort of local capital markets?
As the person who built various models, which did genuinely show that the increase in manufacturing employment in America was likely to draw both labor from the Mexican countryside and some Mexican labor back across the border. We weren't terribly worried about increases in legal or illegal immigration from Mexico. Right? And of course the fact that we're economists, and we think that if you move someone from Ciudad Juarez to El Paso, you move a 25-year-old male from Ciudad Juarez to El Paso, and you've boosted lifetime world GDP by on the order of $500,000. Right? We economists have a very hard time resisting calls for increasing pace of immigration, even with all the effects on domestic U.S. income distribution and so forth. I think largely because we're very confident that what immigrants bring in the way of culture to America is very valuable. And that, if you want to both move the capital to where the people are and the people to where the capital is. So I think the first part of my answer is we didn't worry about it that much. And what was the second part of the question?
Didn't worry about it in the sense that, why wasn't it part of the plan to kind of make, facilitate that movement? Could it have been?
Well, because it was because Newt Gingrich said that no Republican would vote for it if 100 Republican representatives didn't, if 100 Republican representatives, or rather he said that unless if 100 Democrats voted for it, he would promise 150 Republicans. But that required that Clinton do nothing to get them upset. And to say that we were planning on increased immigration from Mexico would have gotten them upset. Even though we weren't planning on increased immigration from Mexico, and I didn't even have to spin the models at all to reach that conclusion. It genuinely seemed that we would have sufficiently strong employment growth in northern Mexico to soak up. As to where the export surplus, well, And look, I have very nice, my lifetime analytical nature, as I said before, comes with a small critique I wrote of Rudy Dornbush and was it Freddie Sturzenegger paper in 1993 about the long-run trade balance between the U.S. and Mexico. And I was saying, hey, look, NAFTA passes. All of a sudden, you're going to have $30 billion a year or more of potential capital flowing out of the U.S. looking for a relatively low-wage export platform with guaranteed tariff quota-free access to the largest consumer market in the world. That's got to make the chances of a peso crisis much, much less because that's a lot of dollars searching for pesos. What I missed was that when NAFTA comes, you also have $40 billion a year of money from rich Mexicans heading north. Right? Heading north on the grounds that a bank account in Citicorp is a much nicer thing than something held in Mexico City. And this is true not only if you have to flee Mexico from the next revolution and paddle across the Rio Grande. This is also true if you think of any of the remarkable number of things that governments can do to bank accounts that they control. Something like the little corral that the Argentinian government put around the savings of all Argentinians when the crash came in Argentina at the end of 2001 was greatly, greatly resented. And getting your money across the border into New York was something that many more people wanted to do than I at least had imagined possible. And that flow has continued. That kind of flow is one of the things determining the current configuration of global imbalances. That there seem to be a lot of people and a lot of governments that think that moving their money into the United States is a way of buying some form of political risk insurance. And that came as a surprise. Yes?
You mentioned that despite China, the exports from Mexico to the U.S. have increased dramatically.
Yes.
So something else must be going on in the sense that the Mexican economy isn't growing. Have the exports from the U.S. to Mexico increased comparably?
Well, yeah, but they're largely things that Mexico needs to industrialize. And I'd say that the volume is one thing, the price is another. Margins on Mexican exports to the U.S. are far below what anyone expected they'd be 12 or 13 years ago. Very precisely because China is sitting on the sofa of export-led development and pushing everyone else off. They imagined they'd be selling electronics and auto parts, and still are selling auto parts, electronics, and textiles for much higher prices than it turns out they can.